Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 5 of the training. This week, we're going to be looking at working one-to-one with clients online. So one of the first things that you really need to consider as a therapist is who is actually suitable to work online. And the truth is not everybody is. So I want you to think about several of these factors as we go through them. So it has to be somebody who has Wi-Fi. If somebody is using data off a phone, it can be swallowed up very quickly by being on Zoom or another video platform. So it's really best that that person can connect to Wi-Fi. It's also really important that they're competent with a computer and problem solving. And of course, you will be there to guide them and support them. And so therefore you need to be competent, as we've already discussed before. But just some basic level of competence in being able to use a computer, to log on to Zoom, and to be aware of different security implications. We also want them to have the ability to access technology reliably with safety and privacy. And we're going to be going over some of that today, just as a recap for everybody. They also want to have the mental, cognitive, physical, and emotional states to be online. And they need to have a safe, uninterrupted space for sessions. And so one of the things I've provided you with is, this is a link at the bottom, but I've also put it onto our group on my website. And so this is really a cool article, and it is a bit dated, but it actually has still incredibly relevant information. And it's an article about assessing the person's suitability for online therapy. And so I really recommend that you give that a read this week. So when online therapy is not suitable, so if a person presents with suicidal ideation, if they've had recent psychotic episodes, if they have ongoing substance dependence, so this could be alcohol or drugs, a display and evidence of a thought disorder. So for example, it's not very good if somebody has schizophrenia, and also in emergency situations. And so it's really important that, people will come to your website with an emergency issue. So it's really important that you have emergency contact numbers on your site. And I'm going to discuss this a little bit more later. So it's important to explore and assess the client's reason for choosing online therapy. And this is something that you would ask when you do your intakes. And I'm going to go over that a little bit later. So I also wanted to go over different types of therapy, or teletherapy as it's sometimes called. So you might be doing synchronous or asynchronous. And so synchronous means that you're connected at the same time. Asynchronous is not online at the same time. In synchronous, it's real-time communication, and in asynchronous, it's delayed conversation. Synchronous is limited participants, and asynchronous is unlimited participants. So for example, a webinar. Synchronous is video conferencing, and asynchronous could be social networking. So thinking about your Facebook groups potentially. So examples of these, synchronous include video conferences, webcasts, phone calls, in-person and instant messaging, and asynchronous, emails, pre-recorded multimedia, text messages, social media, and blogs. So I would say when you're working one-to-one, you're generally going to be working synchronously, using platforms like Zoom in order to support the clients, but you're also going to be using asynchronous methods like email. And so that's going to be really important for you to communicate the boundaries that you have around how often that you check your mail and how that works for you. You might also think about asynchronous in terms of your Facebook group, how often you are going to visit it if you decide to do that. So informed consent. And so the reason I have this up right at the beginning is because every practitioner who practices online should have a page on their site dedicated to informing the client about topics such as the process of therapy, what to expect, alternative avenues of help, and the safeguards in place against the risks of having online therapy. So the important thing to note is that informed consent process begins the moment the client contemplates accessing services. So the minute they click onto your website, they're already having an experience. And so it's really important for us to have clear and precise information that's accessible via our websites. The informed consent process includes a formal acknowledgement from the client to the practitioner, which comes later when we do an intake. And this acknowledgement is received via encrypted channels. Informed consent content is revised during the course of therapy as necessary and beneficial. So be sure to cover issues like handling emergencies and between session contact in the informed consent. Make crisis information available on your website. And I know I keep saying this again and again, but that's because it's so vitally important to do that. So there's more. So informed consent should have a description of the delivery of telemedicine services that will be provided, HIPAA, which is US, or PIPDIA and PIPA, Canadian Notice of Privacy Practices. So that's making sure that you have, you're using platforms that are compliant. So the parameters of the therapist or client relationship, i.e. availability, methods of communication, limits of the service, payment protocols. You also want to have referral and crisis or emergency procedures outlined, crisis and emergency resources in the community of the client. So you'll gather that after doing an intake. Client identity and contact information, protocols for the session, i.e. appropriate attire, privacy, eliminating distractions, and recording of the session, i.e. saying you're not going to do that. You also want to have a backup plan if a session is interrupted by technology failure. And so I'm going to go into this a bit more because we are talking about informed consent when people land on our website, but also the informed consent, that form that we do when we do an intake. So I think it's really important as well to note some of the things that might come up. So we might have a risk of technology use, the benefits of technology use, alternative methods of service, agreed upon emergency plan, social media policy, protocol for contact between sessions, process used for documentation and storage, payment policy, what is the cancellation policy, reasons for a referral could be made to an in-person care, conditions of possible termination of services, and limits of confidentiality and the privacy policy. So it's a lot to take in, but very, very valuable that you know all of this so that you can create it. So telling the clients the advantages and disadvantages. So for example, there might be a lack of visual and auditory cues. You know, we talked about this before, we're just in the square, but do we want the client to stand back so we can see more? Do we want gestures? Do we want them to be able to communicate? It's really important for people to know it's going to be different than a usual face-to-face therapy session. We might want to talk about the limitations of confidentiality via technology, so some security pieces, which we're going to go over in a minute. Some advantages are it's so easy to schedule, like we don't have to get to an office or arrange childcare. You know, I mean, yes, you do if you're, you know, if you don't have somebody to look after your children, so you will need to do that even if you're at home, but it becomes a lot easier for people. It's easier for time management and there's no need to incur transportation costs. And you can pass these savings on to your client, but ensure they know the reasons, that is that you have fewer overheads, not that the service is inferior.